Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here. Thank you all so much for being here. And especially big thank you to our three incredible panelists speaking at today's event, Disability and Disclosure in Education, How, When, and If You Decide to Disclose. My name is Brandy Tomlinson, and I'm a staff attorney in the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness program at Disability Rights New York. My pronouns are she and hers, and I am the white female with the brown hair, green jacket suit on, and the white doors in the background. Before we begin, I'd like to give a brief technology overview. This training is being recorded. The training has closed captioning. You can access closed captioning by clicking the three dots at the bottom of your screen and selecting Show Subtitle or View Full Transcript. American Sign Language, also known as ASL, is also being provided for this session. You can pin the ASL interpreter to your screen by hovering over the ASL video, clicking the three dots, and selecting Pin. Lastly, please keep yourself muted and cameras off during the duration of the session. Now that we have the fun part over, what I would like to do now is briefly introduce each panelist with their bio and backstory. We'll then hear from the panelists about their personal experiences and advocacy. Please feel free to place any questions you may have in the chat box. And what we will do is we will collect these questions and answer them during our last panel, the Q&A panel on September 1st. Additionally, before we begin, I'd like to do a quick terminology overview. When we're talking about secondary level of education, we're referring to kindergarten to 12th grade. And when we are talking about post-secondary level of education, we are referring to education being received after high school, generally known as college. So let's get started, everyone. First up, we have Sarah Taylor. Sarah is a parent social worker and founder of the BIPOC, Peak Parent Mental Health Project, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, who are parents elevating their voices to educate and empower each other, to eliminate disparities and equities and services related to emotional health of our kids. Over the years, Sarah has become a well-respected leader and voice promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion across systems, while reminding organizational leaders that everyone has a role. Not only is she a voice for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but she has become a strong advocate for mental health. And she is here today to talk about her experiences as a parent of a child with mental illness and the obstacles she has had to overcome to ensure her child is receiving the special education that she is entitled to at the secondary education level. Now, depending on a community's racial and socioeconomic makeup, children of color with non-obvious disabilities, such as mental illness, may not be sought out as actively as they are in wealthier white communities. And as you know, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, school districts have what is known as a child find obligation. What this means is that school districts are required to identify, locate, and evaluate children with disabilities. Sarah, can you tell us about the moment you realized as a parent that your child needed special education services, and how was this process initiated? Did you disclose your child's disability to the school district, or did the school district actively child find your child as a disability? And what was the process like for you?
Thank you so much, Brandy, and all the coordinators for having me today. As you know, this topic is very passionate for me and some of the advocacy work that we're doing around upstate New York, particularly around communities of color. I can tell you our journey was very complex, very daunting, and lots of learning for someone that has a social work and administrative background. All of that goes out the door when it's your child. When it's your child, you can have all the experience. But when particularly it becomes, when we talk about mental health, there's still a lot of stigma that is associated with mental health. And children with mental health conditions are often blamed. They're blamed, and it's not looked at as a medical condition. It's looked at as a behavioral condition. So early on, when my little one was in daycare, I noticed some issues, our peer relationships, her not being able to sleep and focus. And me coming from a family that has a lot of beliefs around mental health system and medication, I kept saying she'll grow out of it. She'll grow out of it. And so one of the solutions for really that I had in my mind to address some of the things that I was seeing with her was, let me take her out of a public daycare and put her into the a private setting. And so that was my solution for not really wanting to deal with all of the system related issues that I heard that families have to go through. And as a social worker, that I have witnessed, particularly when it comes to Black and Brown children. And so wanting to pull her out of public childcare into a private school, that's what I did. And still in private school, working with her pediatricians who said, you know what, as she gets older in first grade, the teachers, and this was a private school at first, were saying that she's not able to focus, and they were seeing a lot of disruptive behaviors. And so at that point of first grade, I decided, let me talk to the pediatricians. And so I talked to the pediatricians. We took all the different assessments, and she was diagnosed with ADHD. And at that time, realizing that there was some disruption in her ability to function at school, I agreed at that point to ADHD medication, but did not want to engage in treatment. So between the school, and again, the difference, Brandy, is that she was in private school. And so as she got older, it became a struggle, and she went to a different private school. And at that point, I knew it was myself and the doctors that talked about her needing extra support. Again, recognizing the difference between the capacity and adhering to the laws around special education and a private school and a public school look different. And so I knew, being a city resident, and everything that I know about school systems, that I knew I had to be proactive. And so I started asking around for advocacy and reaching out to some of the legal services. And our first interaction with the CSC system, I was well prepared, only because I have heard historically some horror stories about families navigating the CSC system. Now, while I was prepared, doesn't mean I was ready for what was ahead, that mountain that we were going to have to climb, from understanding the terminology, from understanding the law, from understanding what to ask for. And I think one of, if I can say, our only saving graces was that she was in a private school, and we had to go through the suburban where the private school was housed physically. The law is you go through that CSE. And so that was, I would say, our saving grace early on, of not needing legal services. I'm sorry, I'm using terminology. I want to be very careful of that because I'm an advocate. Committee on Special Education. And so working with a suburban school district, they were very, very proactive. I had called the city school district and didn't get a lot of answers or calls returned. And so again, I got clarification that because she was in a private school, that wherever district, that was our first interaction with the Committee on Special Education. And I can tell you, it was not as hard getting started as I thought it was. And so I think for me, initiating it, asking questions, consulting with some legal advocates about what to ask for, knowing that our situation looked a little different, because I was a city resident with a child in private school that had unique needs. And even looking at her IEP, her plan, when it was developed, it looked different in a private school setting. And so versus a public school setting, and even working with the private school saying, listen, we need better accommodations. We need this to happen. We need to work. And that was a challenge, because understanding the capacity of the school looked a little different than a public school. And so I worked with them and legal services to make sure that her needs were met. But if I was a typical parent, and we're all parents, but that didn't have a little bit of social work advocacy in me, I mean, understanding the terminology, understanding what to ask for, understanding what paperwork you need from the doctors, the school, and this and that's a lot to keep up with. That's a full-time job. And when we think about disparities and oppression and social determinants of health, and particularly individuals in poverty that may not speak up, that may not ask the question, that may just get calls that your child is being suspended due to behaviors, may not know what to ask for, Brandy. And so I think, even though I did have a little support, and it's still the paperwork involved, understanding the terminology, understanding plans, understanding when they talk about, okay, what category? Well, what does that mean? What category? Why does my child have to be in a category? And just really trying to help systems, the Committee on Special Education use strength-based language. Because when you are reading all these documents about what your child isn't and what they can't do, that really impacts you in your self-esteem and your self-worth, and a lot of guilt and shame. So I think, really challenging providers and educators and those that are around the Committee of Special Education to use strength-based language, because it's often, when you're reading it, it looks pretty derogatory and looks pretty bad on paper. And so when you're in a meeting asked to talk about your child's strengths after you're hearing everything that's wrong, and it's like, woo, here. And also, the stereotypes that often come with being a city resident, being a family of color. There's often stereotypes that are perpetuated that, you often, some parents may not challenge them. I'm going to be one that's going to speak up and say, what do you mean? Or what are you saying? But someone that doesn't know or not comfortable is not going to feel empowered around the table, where you're sitting at a table as a parent with others that are in power making decisions about your child's care. There's a level of intimidation around the table that you have to be able to overcome. And I think with having advocacy helped me along the way. Having, Jane Gabriel and the others that have helped me on this journey was extremely helpful. But it was very intimidating and daunting.
It's a very good point that you raised. If a parent is not aware of a school district child find obligation and they themselves don't understand the special education process, that's an opportunity for many children, especially children of color with disabilities, to be missed that should be receiving services. Which leads me to my next question. Under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, students with disabilities must be place in what's known as the least restrictive environment, which is generally should always be the general education setting when possible. Can you tell us about the barriers and difficulties you encountered once your child was deemed eligible for special education and her placement in a residential treatment facility, and how that has been for you?
You know, I can tell you just the whole process of needing residential was emotionally draining, because, you know, for a child to be at the level of needing residential, things must have been unsafe at home, which they were. And even navigating and working through barriers in within a residential system and understanding that, you know, asking questions. I didn't know anything about FBAs, functional behavioral assessments, or what that should include. You know, I think for myself, some of the barriers to answer your question is understanding the language. You know, if it's intimidating for me, a seasoned social worker and administrator, this is intimidating. The language that is not broken down and understanding how it applies to the plan, you know, understanding the ratios when they talk about 5-1, 6-1 setting. Well, what does that mean? You know, break it down. So I think when we're talking about barriers, the language is a huge barrier and a huge intimidating barrier. You know, luckily, you know, having Jane along the way to explain, you know, do you know what this means before we go into a meeting? Do you know what they have categorized her what? Do you look, have you looked at the plan and recognizing that many systems, and I will say it, many mental health systems have blamed COVID for lack of capacity and lack of ability to implement quality services. And so, you know, recognizing that when providers are under pressure, they're going to do the least amount of work that they need to do. And that's a fact. That is what it is, whether we agree with it or not. And so having, you know, cookie cutter plans that they just cut and paste from one child to another and not individualized was huge for me. And if it wasn't for me calling in, you know, a legal advocate to go with me along the way, I wouldn't have known what to ask for. I wouldn't have known that this was clearly a cookie cutter, that they just cut and paste it from one child to another. You know, I wouldn't have known to ask for, you know, modified schedules and different things. So I think, you know, we can have all these laws that protect families, but if we don't understand them in language that makes sense, and I haven't even talked about culturally appropriate language, you know, I speak English. So we haven't even talked about that layer of barrier for many communities of color that English may not be their first language. And so when we talk about some of the experiences in residential are related to our education, I would have thought, being a licensed residential facility, that things would have been a lot smoother. But when you have you have the residential component that may not be communicating with the school component, that have two different goals and two different views of your child. And if one is viewing your child as a behavioral problem and another is ready to put in some accommodations, that really was very confusing and frustrating. Again, when you are in a residential setting that's licensed for mental health, I'm expecting them to treat and serve my child with a medical lens, a medical and psychiatric lens, not a criminal justice lens. And I think that has been some of my frustration in residential and going through you know, services and educational committees around mental health. Mental health is criminalized. I can't say it enough. Our society views mental health in the same way as criminal justice. And it's often blamed and not looked at as a medical condition. So that was some of my barriers and frustrating, making sure that everyone in that setting, from the residential team to the medical team and the educational team, is on the same page regarding her needs and what some of the plans should be, and making sure they have the capacity to uphold the plan and within the law is important. Provider accountability is huge.
That's a really good point about the language barriers. And I think that can be said for so many parents. Parents go to these CSC meetings and, I think sometimes school districts can run these meetings very business informal like. There's no time to say to the parent, do you understand what an FBA is? Or do you understand what the IEP is? Or why your child qualifies for a certain category? It's often it's almost like a factory mill, they're chucking off number one, number two, number three. So it's a very good point. And, it's something the school district should be trying to do more, trying to educate parents who may be completely new to the special education process.
Yeah. And also choice, Brandy, because when we were looking at therapeutic, educational settings, community-based education, you're often, and I don't want to say pigeon-toed, but pushed toward whatever the district wants you to be in. That's going to cost them the least amount of money, I'm going to say it, versus what your child's need is. So I think choices too. And really, and again, when you're talking about communities of color that are often living in impoverished communities, they're not always given choices. They're told, nope, you got to go to this school. Nope, you got to go to this. Even if you have documentation that your child needs a therapeutic setting, having that level of advocacy and understanding and confidence to understand what your child needs is important.
Absolutely. And, speaking of parents of color, can you tell us about, as a parent of color, about overcoming the stigma and shame associated with mental health in the special education system and the guilt that parents of color often feel? And what advice would you give to these parents?
Yeah. Well, I'm always very clear to say, although I cannot speak for every parent of color, I have led a number of groups leading parents of color around mental health advocacy and educational advocacy. So I feel comfortable talking about some of the themes. And cultural stigmas and belief, we can go back to, even as we talk about vaccines and the belief and the distrust of systems among communities of color are real. They are real. As we think about systemic racism and oppression, distrust is real. So when we, began to explore mental health services, I did not want that stigma, because I knew coming with that stigma in my mind came with a lot of problems, came with a lot of rejection, came with a lot of dysfunctional service delivery. So there wasn't, when I think about mental health, there is negative connotation that comes with mental health. And that's how I was raised, and that's how I believe. And then you add this distrust that in belief that, they're just going to put your child on medication and that's it, nothing else. They just want you to medicate your child and push medicine. And so you also have those beliefs that often come up about pushing medication and not wanting your child labeled for the rest of your life. Understanding that many children with disabilities, particularly mental health disabilities, may not make it through school, and that you don't want that stigma or that label on your child. So there's a lot of layers regarding stigma, just the negative connotation that comes with mental health conditions. And I think, peer education has been a great support of having to help overcome. Being in spaces with parents like myself, sharing our story, helping them navigate the complex system, getting past all the guilt and shame that often comes with, your child being in the hospital, or your child being in the facility, or your child, or even having, distrust when something happens and child protective is called on you. That's another major system related issues that often impacts communities of color. And even now, as you talk about school and virtual learning and families' capacities to have their children online and learning and not understanding the barriers or resources that are available. And then when your child doesn't show up for school online and someone calls child protective of you, you have another systems level distrust that has mounted up to wanting to give up and not wanting to have your child connected with systems. So I think continue to work on anti-mental health stigma campaigns, specifically that are culturally responsive and relevant, making sure that our systems are committed to diversifying their workforce in clinical professionals, education professionals. I could tell you, I was just at a meeting at my daughter's residential school, and I walked in the room, and with 15 people in the room, I was the parent, and I was the only person of color around the table. So I think really looking at a number of different, from a personal peer-to-peer advocacy, from system level advocacy, diversifying the workforce, and making sure that we have trusted voices that are willing to go into communities of color and explain the educational laws and rights in their language, on their territory, on their turf, would be extremely helpful moving forward.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's so important, a community, as a community and school district, I think we all have a responsibility to develop and rebuild the trust that has been broken down. So thank you so much for everything that you shared. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and really working with schools too, the school social work teams, to understand, mental health again is often, it's behavioral, it's trouble, it's criminal, and really begin to look at mental health as a medical condition and allow it that much sympathy and research and advocacy like we do with some of the chronic medical conditions.
That's a very good point. Oftentimes school districts view these low-income children as behavioral problems, exactly like you said. And that stigma absolutely needs to be erased. And it's definitely something the community and school districts need to continue to build upon. Thank you so much for your time, Sarah. Next up, we have Denise Elliott. Denise is an individual with a non-obvious disability and has a master's in secondary special education in transition services. Currently, Denise is a 3P law student at Brooklyn Law School and is a former and current legal intern at Disability Rights New York. In 2020, she was the president of her law school Disability Advocacy Law Student Association. Denise was diagnosed with mental health diagnosis as a child, but did not receive accommodations at the secondary level. Today, as an adult, she has been diagnosed with a new later developmental disability known as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, and will be sharing her personal experiences surrounding that. Unlike at the secondary level where a school district has a child find obligation, at the post-secondary level, the student with a disability must disclose their disability in order to receive reasonable accommodation. Denise, can you tell us about the stigma you felt when you were younger that led you to choose not to disclose your disability, and how your later educational and legal experiences shape your decision to identify for the first time as an individual with a disability?
Hi, I'm Denise. I am a white woman with long brown hair. I'm wearing a black shirt, and I want to say thank you for having me. I've been an intern at DRNY for 2 summers, and I want to say that this is my first time actually outwardly labeling myself to the public as being a disabled person. So this is terrifying, but very exciting. As a child, I was always, I don't know if sick is the right word, but I was always labeled as having illnesses, and they were either attributed to anxiety or depression or just being like socially awkward, I guess. And every time I tried to say I'm struggling, I was told that I was just anxious and that my grades were good and there wasn't a problem. And to complicate the story a little bit, both of my brothers have autism. They're on very different ends of the spectrum. They both have ADHD. And my younger brother, who is more, I don't like any of the terms used, but more obviously autistic, and has been in a lot, he has a lot of violent tendencies. So they're very obvious. Everyone would see my brother and they'd be like, "You're fine," which I didn't want to burden my family and I didn't want to burden the people around me. And I started believing that I was lying. So I have like a lot of that internalized. And as a just like to explain where I'm coming from as a white, well, I guess I was a child, so a white girl. I lived in Westchester growing up because my parents immediately moved into a district that could deal with some of my brother's more severe disability complication. I don't know if those even words, just could deal with disabilities at all. And I totally forgot. Oh, so I was in Westchester. There are a lot of services, and I was told, even with my family background, and if anyone knows about ADHD, it's often that you should, if 2 children have it, the third might have it. And I was never checked out or anything like that. And I just, every time I did speak out, I felt so belittled and like I was lying that I just stopped talking.
I'm so sorry that you had that experience. I think so many children with disabilities, they feel like if they identify with a disability, they're going to be belittled. And, it's that stigma of feeling shame. So it's unfortunate that many children experience that. Now, I know it can be harder for adults who have been later diagnosed with a disability and perhaps who didn't receive accommodations at the secondary level due to a later diagnosis to receive accommodations at the post-secondary level. Can you tell us about the stigma and the barriers associated with receiving a later disability diagnosis as an adult? And how did that influence your decision to disclose or not disclose your disability at the post-secondary level?
Right, that's a loaded question. So there are a lot of parts to this. So I don't think I realized until very recently, and I'm in my late 20s, I am in law school, I have a master's, I went through undergrad, both of my brothers are disabled, and I'm only now figuring out, oh, that's me too. And throughout that process, so I'm in the process of getting the official diagnosis, but I was told by multiple doctors, and I've done a battery of tests now about my additional diagnosis of ADHD and kind of what that looks like for an adult and a female adult, because gender is also a part of ADHD, and it's part of why physicians don't often look for females with ADHD, or because it looks different, they don't know what the signs are. I've always been very good at school because I also have OCD, and they tend to work very well to make me do my homework or I'll be a mess. So I've always been academically, I guess, I have academic achievements. I don't know what the word is. Doing good at that and not good at talking. But so for all those reasons, I didn't get an accommodation until now. And now I'm trying, if I'm being honest, I'm not even sure I want to deal with the accommodations process in law school, because a lot of the accommodations that would be offered for ADHD are extended time. It might be a separate room. Even if I can get that, which would be a struggle because they're going to look at me like, well, you didn't have this diagnosis, so clearly you don't need it, so goodbye. And as the president of the Disability Advocacy Law Student Association, sorry, it's a very long acronym, I've experienced on like helping other people try and get accommodations with much longer history of diagnosis than I did. And I'm sure Brandy will mention this later, but I got so mad, I wrote my journal note on it, which is, if anyone's not in law school, which is probably most people, it's a 35-page paper with a bunch of footnotes where I ranted about how this is a problem. And I'm losing track of the question a tiny bit, but so I know how hard it is, so I'm not even going to bother. But I want to use my voice to try and help other people get to the point where they can ask for it, they know it exists, and hopefully we get more of an understanding that there is an adult ADHD diagnosis, whether it's because you're overlooked in your childhood, which Sarah mentioned much more eloquently, but it's due to a lot of reasons, like where you are, if you're a person of color, if you're female, if you're non-binary. There are so many factors that people are overlooked, and it's important to start looking at them, because I would be the obvious person in the female white upper class or middle class or whatever class to look at, and I was still missed. So there are so many more people that aren't getting the help they need.
That's a very good point that you raised, Denise. I think a lot of adults, particularly who are entering college for the first time with a new diagnosis, I think there's just that stigma, that fear of, well, they won't believe me because they're going to say you didn't get it when you were in 12th grade or 11th grade. Oftentimes, colleges will require documentation. And, unfortunately for some of these students, particularly if they come from a low income family, they might not be able, testing is expensive. They might not be able to afford to get the documentation that colleges and post-secondary institutions are requiring. So it's a very personal decision to disclose and not to disclose. Certainly, I recommend to all my clients that come to me with this issue, try to work with disability services, see if disability services is able to help with getting testing, finding perhaps, some colleges may have health clinics on site or mental health clinics, and those could perhaps offer the testing and the documentation that these colleges require. Which leads me to my last question for you, Denise, which you referenced earlier. So you recently wrote an article for your law school journal, which will be published in the near future, of the impact of receiving your later diagnosis of ADHD. More specifically, you raised the point in your article that this diagnosis should not have been missed in your earlier life. Can you tell us more about that?
Okay, sorry, I was trying to follow along at the same time, and I got myself distracted, which is my classic issue. So I think I maybe touched on it too much in the last question. In the journal,
you are doing fine. If you wanted to perhaps elaborate a little bit more when you were talking about being a white female in a middle class society and how you feel having that privilege meant that you shouldn't have been missed out.
Yeah, so I'll write a note in my journal. No, wait, that's confusing language. So apologies. I will write like an abstract within the note itself to just explain why I even wrote the note at all. A lot of it is, for a law journal, it has to be less personalized, but I have a master's in special education and transition services. Again, like all this theory behind me, all the understanding of what is autism or ADHD, OCD, and sitting there in my late 20s in law school, hearing all these horrible stories from people who were trying to get accommodations and seeing that a lot of the people that were coming to me were female. I am white and female, so a lot of the people coming to me and feeling comfortable talking to me, it was probably a self-selection of who I could hear from. And knowing that there were 5 to 10 people in a single grade who were having that experience, I figured that would be much, much worse for people who weren't white, people who didn't come from Westchester where there are services. And it made me think about, obviously hopefully as a community, we're all thinking about what the impact of race and systems, sometimes I get pictures instead of words, so the translation over here is incomplete. But as we're all thinking about that, yeah, I was trying to reflect how that might be appearing in what I was seeing and how I might be biased and how I should look back at my own life and see, like, how would I talk to someone else in my shoes? How would I talk to someone else who experienced the same things that I did? I would never tell them that they weren't telling the truth. I would never tell them that they didn't have ADHD if they thought they did and they wanted to explore it. And all those thoughts behind my head and how much it would be way worse for someone not coming up with my upbringing. I wanted to write and look into it because I had to spend a whole semester on it. So I figured I should like what I was doing. Well, not like, but a little bit of hate and wanting to solve the problem behind writing this very long paper. And it should come out in December. So if anyone wants to see what I found out, it's pretty much what I've been saying.
I can't wait to see the article, and I'm sure many people here who have joined us today will be looking forward to the article. Thank you so much, Denise, for coming and joining us today, and for also telling us about your article, sharing your experience, and using that article to try to help other people. Thank you so much again, Denise. Next up, we have Fatima. Fatima is an individual with a non-obvious disability and has a Juris Doctorate in law. Currently, she is a staff attorney at the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project and is a former legal intern at Disability Rights New York. In 2019, she was the recipient of the New York State Bar Foundation's Elder Law and Special Needs Section Scholarship. Fatima was diagnosed with a later non-obvious disability diagnosis just as she was about to embark on her freshman year of college and was faced with a difficult decision to defer her admission to college to focus on her mental health treatment. When she began her college studies, she was faced with the difficult decision of whether or not to disclose her disability, as well as the unfortunate disability discrimination that she faced. As we learned earlier with Denise, at the post-secondary level, it is the responsibility of the student to disclose the disability if they need accommodation. However, many students with disability with mental health diagnoses particularly are afraid of being stereotyped or judged. Fatima, can you talk about your decision to not disclose your disability during your freshman year of college and the unfortunate stigma associated with disclosing a mental health diagnosis, as well as how did the effect of not disclosing had on your studies and your mental health? Oh, you were muted, Fatima. Thank you.
Hi, Brandy. Thank you so much for having me. This is also my first time speaking out about my experience. Initially, when I first started college, I was attending Barnard College at Columbia University. I was doing really well academically after having deferred my admission for a year to focus on my mental health. And I didn't really need accommodations at first. I didn't know about the disability office. I didn't know what services they offered. I didn't know that I was even eligible. So it never really occurred to me to disclose that. And so it really didn't have, the lack of disclosure didn't have any effect on me academically because I was doing fine. In terms of the stigma though, that was something I always felt. So like I was saying, in terms of the stigma, I really didn't want anyone to know about my diagnosis or know about my experience. I'd already started college as feeling kind of different from my peers. I was not of the same socioeconomic status as my peers. I was, a person of color. I was the first in my family to attend college. So I already felt this otherness, and I didn't want to add this layer of like mental health and feeling more of the feeling that I didn't belong, which I was already kind of struggling with. So part of that lack of disclosure really to anyone, much less the administrators, even my peers, it was part of the reason of like not wanting to be seen as an other.
Thank you for sharing that. The next question I have for you, under the Americans with Disabilities Act in Section 504, a medical leave of absence is available as a reasonable accommodation for post-secondary students, particularly students with mental health diagnoses who may be in crisis and needing time off from studies or treatment. This also protects your status as a student and your grades as well. Can you tell us about your experience of disclosing your disability for the first time during your sophomore year of college, and which eventually led you to taking a leave of absence?
Yes, so the first time I disclosed was in my sophomore year. I registered at the Office of Disability Services, and I think halfway through the spring semester, I was getting really ill and I was very depressed and I was hospitalized for a week. At that time, in order for me to get incompletes and withdrawals, I had to disclose to my dean. I think there's a dean for each class. And so for my sophomore class, I had a specific dean I would speak to, and she arranged for me to get an incomplete and several withdrawals. And because it was so far in towards the semester, the leave of absence was actually quite short. I was able to return the following fall semester, and it wasn't an issue. During the summer, I completed whatever assignments were necessary for me to finish the incompletes. So I was back on track by the fall semester. Then I had a second leave of absence, and this was during my junior year at Barnard. I was continuing to struggle throughout the fall semester after having been hospitalized the semester prior to the summer. And in the fall semester, I had a string of C's, which was, for anyone who knows me, is very highly unusual. And by the spring semester, I moved out back into my parents. At the time, I was initially living in the dorms. I moved out back to my parents, and I was struggling academically, and I had several visits with a psychologist on campus. And at one point, I was struggling even to get to class, to get on the subway, and to physically be present. And that's when the second leave of absence was initiated. And this is when a dean at the school encouraged me to withdraw from the school. And at the time, I didn't fully understand that there was a difference between withdrawing from classes and returning to school and having a short leave of absence versus withdrawing from the school itself. Because if you withdraw from the school, then you have to apply for readmission. Now, I was at a point where I didn't fully understand that. And I was at a point where I couldn't get up and go sign the paperwork for the withdrawal. And my dean had to sign my papers for me on my behalf. When I later submitted the documents for readmission because I wanted to return for my senior year, indicating that I was better, I'd gotten treatment, I never heard back from the school. So that second leave of absence was really not very temporary. Ultimately, I transferred to a different school. I got my grades back up, and here I am, an attorney. But that initial experience was horrifying. As someone who, I didn't have parents who went to college. I didn't have anyone to tell me this is what you should do, this is what you should not be doing. I didn't have anyone advocating for me. The disability services department was, in my opinion, a joke, and I really didn't get much support from them. And I always had to reach out to the deans for help. And it was very uncomfortable disclosing to deans of academics my disability just to get an accommodation. It was not comfortable.
It's so unfortunate that you had that experience, because that pretty much amounts to disability discrimination when they encourage you to withdraw and then you never heard a response. And in fact, they had the obligation to engage in that interactive process with you about a medical leave of absence. You're absolutely right. There's a difference. And I think a lot of students with disabilities don't understand the difference between withdrawing from school and going on a medical leave of absence. If you take that medical leave of absence as a reasonable accommodation, you're protecting yourself as a student. You are still considered a student. Versus whereas you raised, where if you're forced to withdraw, as you were in your case, you have to reapply. You're no longer considered a student. Not only that, but there could be financial issues as well. Sometimes when students are forced to withdraw, they will get a bill from the college. By the way, you owe us X amount of dollars. And it's just for a student with mental illness, that should add even more on top of the crisis, where if you just took that leave of absence, you're not going to get that bill, so there's a huge difference. And I'm so sorry you had to go through that experience. The last question I have for you is you referenced it earlier, you mentioned about colleges having disability services officers in order to self-identify and receive accommodation for classes and exams. I know you had two different experiences with your two different colleges and then law school. Can you tell us about the differences between all three of them?
Sure, absolutely. my first experience was at Barnard, where there was a disability office. And I mentioned briefly that I really didn't feel like I received much support. I mean, I was there almost a decade ago, so I can't really speak to their services right now. And I hope that they've improved. But at the time, I really didn't feel like I was getting much support. I often had to rely on the deans to advocate for me to get an extension, or, I would work it out with the professor, hey, professor, can I get an extension? And it was at the discretion of the professor at the end of the day. So since then, and one thing I want to mention sort of that might have come up a little bit in terms of assessments is that when I was at Barnard, I didn't yet have a formal psychoeducational assessment by a psychologist. So I didn't have the testing to identify what accommodations were appropriate for me. So that could have also contributed to my experience there, because I didn't have the evidence, the backing to support, this student needs an accommodation. Whereas in the second institution, I transferred over to the City College at the City of New York, where I was part of the Skadden Arps Honors Program. And there was a designated disability office, and I registered. And at that time, I had a formal psychoeducational assessment. And that assessment laid out all the accommodations that were appropriate for me, double time on exams, and I would take exams in separate rooms. I had a paper that I would give to my professors, and the professors would arrange for me to take the exam at a different point. And so it was just more streamlined. And I think that the disability office was stronger in their advocacy for students, and I worked really well with them. Ultimately, my grades were far more steady. I graduated the top 10% of my graduating class. And I really believe that my ability to get my grades up and to graduate as the first in my family to attend college, all of that was made possible because I had a disability services office that really worked well with me. I had professors who worked really well with me. And I had the psychoeducational assessment that provided that backing. It wasn't just a diagnosis, it was the fact that this diagnosis results in XYZ, and therefore the student deserves XYZ accommodation. That was my second college experience. My last experience was at law school. I attended CUNY Law School, and I would say they had the best disability services office. And shout out to Pat Kennedy. If anyone knows her, she was just completely fantastic to work with. In law school, all the students receive a sort of number that identifies the student. So we don't take our exams with our names. And what would happen is that the disability services would set up a time and a space for me to take the exam outside of when my peers were taking it. And before the professors were grading the exams, my exam would fit in with the rest of my peers, and the professors would have absolutely no idea which student took it with an accommodation or not. I did well in law school. I never had to deal with, do I need to tell my professor? And a single professor of mine never knew what my disability was, or that I even had a disability. All they were doing was grading papers that were numerically identified and not identified by name. So it was just a completely different experience. I later got accommodations on the bar exam, and now I'm a licensed attorney.
It's unfortunate the different experiences between all these different colleges the students with disabilities have. You would think, with the American with Disabilities Act and Section 504 being so clear on the rights of students with disabilities to receive accommodation, that there would be no disparity, but unfortunately there is, and I really think it comes down to disability services, and it's really their role to be educated about the law, and also to make sure professors are educated as well on the law. And I think it's amazing, your law school was the first time I've heard of personally of giving numbers instead of names. And I think that is amazing because, unfortunately, there are professors that, do believe in that stereotype that if someone's getting time and a half for anxiety or something, that having that extra time gives them an advantage, but it really does not give them an advantage. It levels the playing field is what it does. So thank you so much, Fatima, for sharing your story with us. I know this was the first time that you shared it, and I really appreciate it. You have come a long ways. You're doing amazing now. You're an attorney. You're doing great. So I'd like to give a big thank you to all three of my panelists, Sarah, Denise, and Fatima, for sharing their experiences with us today. I hope everyone found their stories as inspirational as I did, and to always remember to never give up on your dreams or your dream for your child. I hope everyone will tune into our next panel series discussing COVID-19 on August 25th at 3 p.m. And if you haven't already, don't forget to register for that event. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a great night.